Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today, for the first time in over 10 months, we will be reviewing a Sharks game, this being Game 1 of the shortened 2021 regular season against the Arizona Coyotes. And this one started off kind of slowly between both of these two teams. Nothing too much happening within the first few minutes until the Coyotes ended up taking a penalty, which would eventually lead to this Tomas Hertl power play goal to put the Sharks up 1-0. Hertl would add yet another one on top of that, and the Sharks would have a 2-0 lead going into the first intermission. And while the Sharks had played a decent first period, it wasn't necessarily one that was dominated by them, and so being able to emerge up 2-0 was a pretty good thing for that. Coming into the second period, however, the Coyotes began to push really hard in the early parts of that second period and would eventually end up getting a power play goal of their own, coming from Connor Garland, a name you will likely hear a couple of times in this review, and they cut into the lead 2-1, and that would be the score heading into the third period. Now, early in the third period, again, the Coyotes would be pushing, maybe not as much as they were in the second period, and the Sharks would manage to hold them off up until about 7 minutes remaining, when the Sharks would once again restore their 2-goal lead here with an Evander Kane's perfect solo effort, a great play. He actually got held up by, I believe it was Jacob Chychrun, on this play, which could have potentially led to a penalty shot, but instead Kane managed to stay up on his feet and score this goal anyway. And so the Sharks, as I said, got their 2-goal lead back, and it looked like they might be able to close it out with about just under 4 minutes to go in the third period. It is a great solo play by Connor Garland. He just weaves through multiple Sharks players before getting the pass to the wide open Clayton Keller in the slot. He buries it top shelf to cut the lead again in half and make it a 1-goal game. And then in the dying seconds of the third period, 3 seconds to go, it is Phil Kessel who bats it out of the air and ties it up for the Coyotes. We head to overtime, and it's a pretty eventful overtime, I guess. The Coyotes get a marvelous chance to end it, not on a breakaway, but instead on a 2-on-0 between, I believe, Clayton Keller and Derek Brassard, and yet Brassard ends up getting robbed by Martin Jones. Eventually, the Sharks get an overtime power play where more or less nothing happens, and we head to the shootout where the Sharks show off maybe a reason why they picked up Ryan Donato. He scores a beautiful shootout goal to tie it up, I believe, since the Coyotes scored on their first shooter. Logan Couture would show off a very nice shootout move as well to add a second goal with the Sharks, and because of a Connor Garland post in the shootout, as well as a miss from another Coyotes player, the Sharks get the extra point. But it was a game where the Sharks probably could have taken both, and while this wouldn't necessarily matter all that much if this were a regular, normal 82-game season, in a 56-game season, especially when the Sharks are going to be fighting tooth and nail with these 4 other teams in the West Division, likely for the final spot in the playoffs, and the Coyotes being one of them, giving a point here instead of giving no points here could end up coming back to bite them, but I guess we'll end up seeing if that happens. First thing, of course, to talk about would be Martin Jones. After 2 pretty subpar years for Martin Jones, we were going to see if he could have a bounce back here, and this first game here is definitely a great sign for Martin Jones. Plays a very nice game. Yes, he lets in 3 goals, though 3 goals on 37 shots still gives him pretty good stats, especially since the game ends up going to shootout. But Jones really had to bail the Sharks out multiple times. There were a couple of breakaways in the first period, the 2-on-0 in the overtime that I mentioned, and just a lot of calm and good saves by Martin Jones. Unfortunately, the game ended up getting a bit away from him in the last couple of minutes. The Clayton Keller goal, I don't think he had much of a chance on at all, just very poor defensively, but he definitely could have maybe done a better job of controlling the rebound that would eventually lead to this Phil Kessel goal. But in the end, it was still a very solid game for Martin Jones, and hopefully that is a sign of good things to come this season. Next thing to talk about would be some of the new blood for the San Jose Sharks. A few players either being brought in from other teams or just in general playing their first NHL game or one of their first NHL games. First one, and maybe we'll go a bit quick fire here since there's a few of them. First one, of course, would be John Leonard, probably the most important role, or probably the most important player to be filling the most important role here of this new blood, filling in a spot on the second line, and Leonard ends up putting up 2 assists in this game, assists on the second Hertl goal as well on the Kane goal. And while the Kane goal, it was a fantastic solo effort by Evander Kane, so Leonard shouldn't get too much credit for the assist. He does make a couple of very nice plays on the second Tomas Hertl goal. Not only does he activate the speed and then take that shot that goes wide, but he ends up doing a great job of recovering the puck from behind the net and also doing a good job of getting the puck on net eventually to lead to that Tomas Hertl goal in the end. So a solid game from John Leonard. I don't think there's really any player on the Sharks that stands out besides Martin Jones as having a great game for himself, so I'm not going to say Leonard was fantastic here tonight, and I didn't necessarily expect him to be a world breaker. He's not like a Connor McDavid level prospect, of course, but definitely a good start here for a potential future second liner for the Sharks. Next new blood would be Ryan Donato. He didn't necessarily have too much of an impact on the game, I would say. Really, his biggest moment, besides, of course, the great shootout goal he scored, was a decent chance in the third period, which I guess was somewhat disappointing. The Sharks were rumored to have this very good third line here. It was super impressive in training camp, apparently, with Ryan Donato, Noah Gregor, and Matt Nieto. That line didn't really end up making much of an impact on this game, and so besides that really one chance in the third period, and of course the shootout goal, Donato wasn't super effective in his debut, though I guess the shootout goal was definitely a big part of the Sharks' win here tonight anyway. And then the final couple of players here are, of course, this third defensive pairing for the Sharks, that being Knyzhov as well as Milosh. Since Shemek ended up sitting out this game, the Sharks had essentially a completely new third pairing tonight. Knyzhov had some early game jitters, but would shake them off somewhat as the game would go on, and he would be rewarded with at least a decent bit of ice time, about 11 minutes for Knyzhov here tonight. Milosh had those early game jitters as well, but never really shook them off, and so would end up only playing just under 6 minutes here tonight. Bit of a rough game for Milosh, and basically what I've learned here from seeing this third pairing play is that the Sharks will be maybe in a bit of trouble if Shemek is not healthy at some point this season. Next, I'll be talking about Erik Karlsson. Besides maybe Martin Jones, Karlsson likely had the biggest spotlight on him tonight for the San Jose Sharks. He was expected to be very good. He had made the comment that this was the best he felt like with the Sharks thus far. And was he good? Well, not really. Take away the name on the back of his jersey, and if you told me what to think of this particular defenseman, I would say it was a pretty average game, very up and down, pretty inconsistent, all things considered. Erik Karlsson had a couple of very nice plays. There was one particular chance where he ends up doing a great shot pass that seemed like a pretty easy tap-in for Couture, just Couture could not end up burying it, but there were also multiple times where Karlsson looked quite sluggish defensively, just wasn't really able to hold the zone a few times. And so it was an average game from a player who is expected to be significantly better than average. Not only is Karlsson a caliber of player who is, one of the best in the league, or supposed to be one of the best in the league, but he is paid as though he's supposed to be one of the best in the leagues. And so if the Sharks are just getting average play from Erik Karlsson, that is a massive disappointment. Now, I must say, to be fair to Karlsson, none of the Sharks players really stood out as being anything spectacular. As I said, this is the first game for the Sharks in over 10 months, so I wasn't expecting this team to come, out firing on all cylinders. And it should also be mentioned that because of the pretty short-handed third pairing for the Sharks of Knyzhov and Milosh, Karlsson ended up playing just over 32 minutes tonight. And after having not played a serious NHL game in over 10 months, coming out and immediately being tasked with playing 32 minutes is not an easy thing to do. So this first not so great game from Karlsson doesn't mean that the rest of the season is going to go poorly for him, but it is still something to note. I should also mention that while the defensive pairings tonight started as Karlsson, Vlasic, Burns, and Ferraro, as this game progressed, it ended up evolving to Karlsson with Ferraro and Burns with Vlasic, and we'll see if that actually persists for Saturday's game. And finally, I will mention Evander Kane. Leonard had a couple of assists, but Kane ended up with 3 points, 2 assists on both Hertl goals, as well as the goal himself off of the beautiful solo effort. Just like I had said when I was talking about John Leonard, I don't think there's really any player besides Martin Jones who had like a fantastic game. So while Kane did put up 3 points, he wasn't consistently great, I'd say. He just sort of, made the good plays when they mattered. And as I said, a fantastic solo effort on that third goal, which would end up being very important for the Sharks' victory here tonight. But the reason why I'm really pointing out Kane here is, of course, there were some question marks coming into this season. There was obviously the question of whether or not Kane would play in general, or if maybe he would opt out of his contract, or how distracted would he be coming into the season with all the things that's happening in his own personal life. But I guess a lot of those fears were quelled here tonight with this 3-point performance from him, which is of course a good thing moving forward for the Sharks. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be right back in action on Saturday as they will take on the Arizona Coyotes a second time. With this shortened 56-game season, the NHL decided to make it so that whenever you play against a team once, you play against them at least another time, and so this is the first example of that situation. We'll see if the Coyotes can get some revenge, or if the Sharks can maybe play a bit more of a complete game and actually close it out in regulation. Class dismissed.